Hello and welcome to NDTV. I'm Aditya Kaul. Recently, Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, had a very successful visit to New Delhi. There's a lot of color, a lot of show as well. The bonhomie between Modi and Putin being spoken about. But what does this also convey about the strategic bilateral partnership between Washington, D.C. and New Delhi? And will it have repercussions on the ties that have been spoken about and also the tariffs? To speak about that and a lot more, joining us right now is Michael Kugelman, who is, of course, the Senior Fellow, South Asia at the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much, Michael, for joining us. Quickly, just to begin by asking you about the recent Putin visit, what were your impressions from it? It happened at a time when the Quad is not happening in New Delhi. There's no official statement yet, but it's understanding that it will not happen. Donald Trump also postponing his visit. So the geopolitical Netflix is underway. What are your impressions from it?
Yeah, well, you remember when Prime Minister Modi went to China and had that meeting with President Xi and President Putin, President Trump did not react well.
Yes.
So, yeah, I've gotten a lot of questions. How did the U.S. see this visit? And I think that there's a way that the U.S. could have seen it and a way that it likely did. In terms of how it could have seen it, well, as you know, Prime Minister Modi and President Trump really have the same view when it comes to the war in Ukraine. It needs to end. So at a moment when the Trump administration is really trying to get this peace process going, one could have thought that maybe the U.S. would see this as an opportunity for Prime Minister Modi to deliver a useful message to President Putin, that this is not an era of war. But I do think that there's a concern in Washington that given how this summit went, it was very successful. There was a very large joint statement with a number of new deals to expand commercial cooperation, to continue military cooperation. I fear the concern in Washington is that the view will be that the Indian government used this visit as an opportunity to bolster Putin and to try to strengthen and broaden the relationship even more, which is, at least at this point, something that the Trump administration does not want to see.
You know, the Indian government for the last 4 years at least has been saying that they will not join one axis against the other. They will, of course, not succumb under pressure. That has been particularly coming in from the Western side.
Right.
There's a lot of preaching lessons, particularly coming from the European Union as well. And India has been concerned and very straightforward about strategic autonomy. That's something that India is not ready to compromise on. But at the same time, there's been a balancing act. Prime Minister Modi visiting Kyiv, meeting Zelensky, at the same time meeting Putin in Moscow and conveying that this is not an era of war. Solutions cannot be found in the battlefield. There should be dialogue and diplomacy. There are now reports emerging that there could be considerable pressure on India to host Zelensky. Do you think that could be perhaps happening in the next few weeks?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we know that the Indian government has tried to project this sense that it, of course, has a very close relationship with Russia, but that it wants to work with Ukraine as well, and that it wants to not necessarily play the role of a formal mediator, but it does want to be a country that could try to deliver this message to both sides about the importance of pursuing diplomacy and dialogue to end the war. And, you know, I said this before, I think India is one of the relatively few governments that has a very good relationship with Russia, but also a pretty good relationship with Ukraine as well, and that counts for something. But to your point about strategic autonomy, it's a very difficult moment. It's a challenging moment for India because, you know, these new sanctions on Russia have really, I think, changed the story. They've really changed the calculus for New Delhi in the sense that it really needs to be careful about how it goes about its energy relationship with Russia, and the fact that, you know, just in the days before Putin's arrival here in New Delhi, that India started reducing its share of oil imports from Russia because of those U.S. sanctions on Russia. You know, I think it shows just the challenges it'll face to navigate these, these different pressures between the U.S. and Russia and the West.
And what do you think about the big elephant in the room, and that's the tariffs? Over the last 10 months or so, tariffs have been changing the geopolitical equations, not just here in South Asia, but all across the globe. Look at China, look at Canada, look at several other countries, their bilateral partnerships with Washington, D.C. But in this case, particularly India.
Right.
You know, India hasn't really been reacting sharply to it, but is concerned. And there is dialogue and diplomacy that is underway. There will be sharp criticism and comments coming in from Donald Trump as well. But what is the way forward? What do you think for us as an American, watching this very closely from D.C., what is the solution for this? Do you think there will be an amicable understanding that will be reached in the next few weeks? And what will be your advice to India?
I mean, the good news is that the moves that India has made recently in terms of somewhat reducing its oil imports from Russia and also signing a new gas deal with the U.S., that I think will address some of the Trump administration's concerns when it comes to the Russia factor in the trade talks. But I think that there's still other issues that have to be worked out, and I suspect there's still other concessions that the Trump administration will be expecting the Indian government to make. And of course, we know that during some of the recent rounds of talks that India's government put its foot down, refused to make certain concessions for I think good, for sound, pragmatic, and political, and just broadly speaking, policy reasons. But you look at the pattern, and countries that get trade deals with the Trump administration to either avert or lower tariffs, they've made a lot of concessions. And so I think that India will face a bit of a difficult moment about how to proceed. That said, we keep hearing, and we've been hearing for many weeks, that the two sides are close to a deal. Now, is that a good thing? That means that it could be any day, or is that a bad thing? If it's been so long that they've been so close, why hasn't there been a deal to this point? In terms of what India, in terms of my advice to India, I think you just have to keep talking. The negotiations need to continue. Of course, it's a difficult moment for U.S.-India ties, but there will be a U.S. delegation coming here, as I understand it, in the coming days to continue the talks. Hopefully, you'll get to something eventually. I do think that in Washington, there is a genuine desire in the White House, which is most important, to get to yes on a deal. So I'd like to think it's just a matter of time.
There are people in the White House and, of course, in the U.S. administration that are very much looking forward to a good ties between in New Delhi and Washington, D.C. Marco Rubio, for instance, has been somebody who's been speaking about it, the former NSA as well. And in this case, Sergio Gore, who is now the U.S. ambassador to India, he will be taking over formally. Do you think that is going to change the equations? Because Sergio Gore is a trusted aide of Trump and would be trying to cement the ties?
Oh, absolutely. And I think you've hit on a really critical point. We need to draw a contrast between messaging and actions from the White House and messaging and actions from others in the U.S. government. I would argue that it's in the White House, which is really driving the policy toward India now, where you've had the hardest line, right? And you had that really sharp criticism. One could even describe it as insults about India, its economy. But I would argue that the State Department, Defense Department, and others, as well as on Capitol Hill, strong bipartisan support for the idea of continued partnership with India. And you're exactly right. The fact that the new U.S. ambassador to India is someone who clearly is a champion of U.S.-India partnership. In his Senate confirmation hearings, he was very positive about the relationship. He's very close to the president. And so that means that if he wants to pursue a policy meant to get this relationship back on track, presumably the president and others high up in the administration are not going to stand in the way.
All right, Michael, I would now urge you to actually go through your magic ball and actually look into the brain of Donald Trump.
Oh.
Donald Trump has been talking about, the jets that were, fired upon or, demolished during the India-Pakistan crisis, but also he's been praising Prime Minister Modi. He speaks about his bonhomie with Modi. He says Modi is a great man. They follow a great equation. But at the same time, he says that the India-Pakistan ceasefire was achieved only because of him. And then he says it was because of trade, which New Delhi completely denies. What do you take from that?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions as to why he keeps focusing on his role in the ceasefire and on the jets that were shot down, and he gives a different number every time. I think on the one hand, you could see it as a pressure tactic, quite frankly, coming back to the trade talks, hoping that if he makes these types of comments that clearly would not go down well here in New Delhi, that it might prompt New Delhi to want to do things that it wouldn't otherwise want to do.
Right.
I don't think that's true. I find that hard to believe. But when it comes to the issue of what he says about his role in the ceasefire, as you know, Trump wants to be seen as the ultimate peacemaker. He wants to be seen as the guy that makes peace. So I guess in that sense, you'd want to sort of put himself out there as that person who did that. But I think that we have to think about the pressure tactic issue above everything else. The fact that it doesn't seem to have worked to this point doesn't seem to have changed his view that he shouldn't necessarily keep bringing focus onto these very sensitive matters that are not going to register well or resonate well here in New Delhi.
And Michael, you've been tracking India-Pakistan very closely as long as I remember for the last many years. What was your takeaway from the India-Pakistan conflict, the 4-day war that happened? Of course, Asim Munir has strengthened his position as a field marshal. He's forever, really going to be there. There's no action expected. Imran Khan continues to be in prison. There's one thing about the domestic politics and the security architecture with the TTP coming in, that the Taliban and Pakistan equation also not working out. But between New Delhi and Islamabad, do you think that there is a possibility that this is perhaps only a temporary ceasefire and there could be a possibility of a full-scale war in future?
Well, the way things were left off, and given the speech that we heard from Prime Minister Modi soon after the ceasefire was announced, there's this implication that things could resume, and setting down new red lines about a terrorist attack in India that's traced back to Pakistan would be seen as an act of war. this to me suggests that we should not be complacent, and that indeed, there is the risk of a resumption of hostilities. Let's be very clear. For me, one of the biggest takeaways from Operation Sindoor is how much it benefited the Pakistani civilian and military leadership, right? Both, particularly the civilian leadership had been very unpopular, and of course you'd seen striking levels of anti-army sentiment in Pakistan in recent years, which I think is part of the Imran Khan effect. But because of how Pakistan performed and the projection of the conflict, how the government and the military projected Pakistan's participation in the conflict to the public, Pakistan's performance was widely backed, including by the sharpest critics. There were even tweets on Imran Khan's X account that were praising the military during the conflict, which is pretty significant. So, that sort of raises an interesting question. Well, the powerful elements in the military did benefit from this conflict. The fact that we've seen these major changes with constitutional amendments and Asim Munir being promoted to field marshal, these are things that did not go down well among the public. So I do think that the goodwill and the trust that the Pakistani leadership was able to win back, some of that could be squandered anew, given these changes that we've been seeing in domestic politics in Pakistan.
Michael, my last question to you, we're running out of time, is about the Chinese approach. We had the Tianjin summit, you spoke about the bonhomie and the pictures that came out between Putin, Xi Jinping and Modi, but there's also the question that happened after Galwan. There was a change in strategy that New Delhi had, and of course recently the National Security Strategy Report of the US speaks about the Indo-Pacific, but their focus hasn't entirely been on Quad. They can compromise on Quad, they can compromise on India, but there is the big elephant China out there, which is trying regional hegemony and their tactics, and they do not abide by the international rule book. So how would you see China's approach and US trying to counterbalance that?
Yeah, we still don't know what the Trump administration's China policy is. President Trump seems to have gone back and forth. I do think that he would want to maintain the competition with China, particularly in an economic context. But, I think because he doesn't want to get dragged into a conflict with China, into a conflict scenario. That, and also he recognizes China's leverage over the global economy. So I think that he would not want to take harsh steps against China that could risk Chinese retaliations that impact and damage U.S. economic interests. So that suggests to me that President Trump might pursue some type of understanding with China to ease tensions. And I think that would certainly be a game changer given how U.S. policy has been for really the last decade at least.
Michael Kugelman, you traveled to the NDTV studios here in New Delhi. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.